Hello again. So the last little section of ecology part 1 is ecological pyramids. So in this, we're going to look at a pyramid of numbers and a pyramid of biomass, see the advantages and disadvantages of each, and then do a little question on them. So the first little part then is about the pyramid of numbers. Now, the pyramid of numbers shows the number of organisms at each stage in a food chain. So if we look at this little food chain, leaves, caterpillars, blue tits, kestrels. So the leaves are the producer, then the caterpillars are the primary consumer, blue tits are the secondary consumer, and the kestrels are the tertiary consumer. And you'll remember from the last little video that this little arrow means the transfer of energy and substances. So the leaves get eaten by the caterpillars get eaten by the blue tits, and the blue tits get eaten by the kestrels. Now what we can actually do with that information, just to give us a better indication of how many organisms are involved, we can construct a pyramid of numbers. So what you'd have to do is go out into the ecosystem and count the actual numbers and then construct a little pyramid like this. So in each case, the producers are placed at the bottom, and in each case, the length of the bar represents the relative number of individuals present. So what we can see here is the producer, which is the leaves, is always at the bottom. So the flow of energy actually goes up this way. And usually what happens in a pyramid of numbers is that as you go up the pyramid, the numbers decrease. Now sometimes it's not like that, so we're just saying that most of the time we see a decrease in numbers. So generally they are pyramid shaped. Right, so let's draw one of these bad boys. So to draw a pyramid of numbers, here's what we need to do. We need to use a scale so that the largest bar will span the full width of the grid. So that's going to be our producer, which you'll also remember the producer always has to go at the bottom. You draw each bar the same depth. So if you look at this scale here, we can see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 levels to draw, and this is rather handily split up into 4 areas. So each bar needs to be the same depth. Then you need to place them in the center of the scale. So this is the center here. And we need to label the x-axis and the bar. So let's do all the labeling first, because that's always something that people miss out. So what we're going to do here is along the x-axis put number of organisms. Then in the center we're going to put 0 and we're going to count outwards. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Now, why are we doing it that way? Well, we said here that you have to place it in the center of the scale, so that means that you need to make the pyramid of numbers symmetrical. So when we plot the first one, which you would do using a ruler, which I'm going to do. When we plot the first bar, which represents the producers at the bottom, and let's just shade it in. So that's our producers. So we have got 30 individuals on this side of the center line and 30 individuals on this side of the center line. So altogether we have got 60 producers. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is plot the primary consumers. Now again, it has to be centered on this and it needs to be symmetrical. So 30 divided by 2 equals 15 on either side. So we go up, and what you'll have noticed here is that I've used the same depth. Oops, pardon me. Shade that in. And that one is the primary consumer. Now, secondary consumer then is 8. So it's going to be 4 on either side. And that's the secondary consumer. And then the final one, tertiary consumer, is going to be a wee thin one at the top. And that is going to be tertiary consumer. And that's how you draw a pyramid of numbers. Now, let's just check the list. Have we done all this? Have we used a scale so that the largest bar will span the full width of the grid? Yes. Have we drawn each bar the same depth? There, 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 and there. Yes, we have. Have we placed in the centre of the scale? Yes, because there's the centre line running down through it. Have we labelled the x-axes? Have we labelled the bars? Yes. So that's our pyramid of numbers done. Now, the final thing you need to know about a pyramid of numbers is advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are that it shows the numbers of individuals at each trophic level. So in the one that we looked at, we could see that there was most leaves at the producer stage. Counting is usually easy. So in the example we did, it's easy to count leaves, caterpillars, blue tits and kestrels, because one individual is very obviously one individual. As well as that, it can be used to compare ecosystems at different times of the year. So you could go out and you could count those number of organisms in the spring, construct a pyramid of numbers, do the same in the winter, and see how their numbers are changed. And that might give you an idea about what's actually happening in the ecosystem. So for example, you go out and you see that there is thousands and thousands of leaves in the springtime. You go out again in the winter and do it, and you see that there's barely any leaves. So then as a result, there's barely any caterpillars or blue tits. And that gives you a good idea of what's actually happening in the ecosystem at that time of year. There's several disadvantages though, and the disadvantages are what you need to focus on. And these two in particular. The disadvantage is that it doesn't take into account the size of the organism. So even though we use leaves in that, what if we had used trees? Trees would still be the producer, but what we would have got is a wee skinny level at the bottom. Then we would have had loads of caterpillars, and then we would have had something like this. So because it doesn't take into size, it doesn't take the size of the organism into account, sometimes they can be inverted or upside down. As well as that, some organisms are difficult to count. If we'd have been talking things like strawberries or buttercups and strawberries actually grow up with their little plant here, but then they send runners either down below the surface or up above. So it's very difficult to work out what actually one plant is. And as a result, it's difficult to get accurate numbers of species in some cases. But as I say, of all the information here, this is the bit that you need to focus on. It does not take the size of organism into account, and some organisms are very difficult to count. So the pyramid of numbers has these problems. But that's fine, because what scientists can do instead is construct a pyramid of biomass. Now, biomass, as the name suggests, is the mass of living material. So, in this type of pyramid, it represents the biomass. This one takes into account both the mass and the number of organisms at each trophic level in a food chain, and is therefore more accurate. Now, these always make a pyramid shape because the mass of the material available will always decrease in moving from one trophic level to the next. Now, you might remember that because when we looked at food chains, when we said there was leaves, then caterpillars, then blue tit, and then a kestrel. One of the things that we had talked about was as you go along the food chain, the amount of energy decreases. So it makes sense then, if the amount of energy decreases, then the mass of material available at the next level is always going to decrease. So if you look at this pyramid of biomass, at the bottom we've got oak trees, which clearly have a massive mass. Then we've got insects, which is decreasing because there's large parts of the oak tree that can't be eaten. Then we've got the blue tits. Now, there's less energy available to the blue tits because the insects use some of it for respiration, they use some of it for movement, and some of the insects can't be digested. And then carrying on to the sparrowhawks, again, there's less and less energy or biomass available there. Now, the problem with it is that biomass is actually the dry mass of an organism, so it's heated in an oven until all of the water is removed. Now, here's a question. How do you dry out a blue tit without killing it? So how do you remove all the water from a blue tit without killing it? Well, you can't. So, if you want to construct a pyramid of biomass, some of the organisms from each trophic level must be killed. And that's because removing the water from a living organism will actually kill it. So that's why this pyramid is less frequently done, because it's quite difficult to obtain the data, because you have to kill the organisms. Now, again, let's look at how you plot them, and then we'll go back to the advantages and disadvantages. So we've got a simple food chain here. Cabbage, caterpillar, sparrow. And it shows the amount of biomass at each trophic level. Now, in this, it says, use one small square to represent 10 grams and label the bars using the key. Now, the same rules apply for this. It has to be centered. The producer is at the bottom. I should say it's centered and symmetrical. It's labeled. And the bottom bar fills the space or the width. So, cabbage at the bottom, 1,000. Let's do it. Dun, 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 dun. 1,000. And I'm just going to freehand that one. Now, we tip, maybe do a little center line down the center. Put 0. Now this time it's 1,000, so we need to do 1,000 divided by 2, which equals 500 on either side. So 0, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. So that means for the biomass, we have got, for the cabbage, and see the way we're given the key here, and it says label the bars using the key, you should actually follow that. So that is our cabbage, which is the producer, and it goes at the bottom. The next one then is the caterpillar. Now the caterpillar is only 60 grams. So 60 divided by 2 equals 30 grams at each side. One small square represents 10 grams. So your caterpillar one actually needs to be tiny, tiny, tiny. And then you're supposed to fill it in. So that's your caterpillar. And then we've got the sparrow, which is 20 grams. And we need to do the key like that. So that's our pyramid of biomass. Now, if we look at the mark scheme for it, we need to have the bars accurately plotted, which, even if I do say so myself, look rather good. Bars the same depth. Yep. And symmetrical. Yes, because I've drawn the centre line down here, so they are symmetrical. Bars labelled or the correct use of the key and sequence. So the sequence should be the cabbage at the bottom, then the caterpillar, then the sparrow. And that's the end of ecological. No, it's not the end of ecological pyramids. Calm your ham. This is the end of the pyramids. So you remember with a pyramid of numbers that one of the problems was it didn't take into account the size of the organism, whereas the pyramid of biomass does take into account the size of the organism. As well as that, it's more accurate. But the major disadvantages that you need to think about are these three things. It's difficult to obtain the data because the organism has to be dried out in an oven. The organism must be killed, which is obviously bad from an ecological point of view, and it may damage the habitat because, again, you've got to take some of the organism, dry it out, and kill it. And that is the end of ecological pyramids. I hope that was as fun for you as it was for me. Bye bye.